Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Science Cafe. So my name is Nathan Duclos-Rickard. If you're not aware who I am, which I'm not shocked of, I'm a high school biology teacher at New Bedford High School. So tonight we are joined by the amazing Bob Rocha and Keith Lovett. And I know we usually start off the night with a nice cheers. So tonight I'm featuring a dropped cider, dry hopped cider. There we go. From Citizen Cider. So cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
All right, a couple brief things before we get started tonight. Tonight is the last Science Cafe for the spring of 2021. We made it. All right, so we are going to be taking a break for the months of July and August, and we'll be returning back in September. Fingers crossed at Greasy Luck Cafe back in person again. So getting a little bit back to normal. All right, we do want to thank the Whaling Museum and Jocelyn Nunes, who's been gracious enough to help us out with the Zoom meetings since March of last year. So we couldn't have done it without them. So huge thank you to your team over there. All right. Without any further ado, our guest tonight, Keith Lovett, the director of the Buttonwood Park Zoo and wildlife conservationist, will discuss the role of modern zoos, utilizing genetic science for the conservation of species. So gone is the menagerie style of public zoo animal displays. And as Keith will tell us more about, given today's plight of many wildlife species becoming threatened or endangered, the modern zoo is working to maintain sustainable, genetically diverse animal populations, as well as conserve species in the wild. And Keith, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Thank you, Nathan. So I'll see if I can share my screen here. All set, everyone can see that?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, good. I've actually done a presentation before where I was talking for like 5 minutes and nobody could see my screen, and I wasn't, nobody told me. So as Nathan said, my name is Keith Lovett. I am the director of the Buttonwood Park Zoo, and I've been director here for about 8.5 years. Prior to that, I was the assistant director down at the Palm Beach Zoo.
Oh, I thought 5 minutes ago.
Okay, I was the assistant director down at the Palm Beach Zoo in West Palm Beach, Florida, and I've been in the zoo field for about 30 years now. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the role of a modern zoo, and I've done that multiple times over my career, but there's going to be a little bit of a spin on it tonight, where I'm going to talk about utilizing genetic science for the conservation of endangered species. So just a quick breakdown where we're going to go from the presentation. I am going to talk about zoos of the past and compare them to modern accredited zoos. So the word accredited is very important there, and I'll explain what that means. And then I'm going to get into species management with genetics and reproductive science. Science. And I do talk about zoos of the past because there are a lot of misconceptions about zoos and what the modern role of a zoo is. And it's good to compare it to history. Zoos have been around for a long period of time. In many regards, they go back to the Egyptians, pharaohs with zoos, if you would, but more likely menageries. The quote unquote modern zoo started in the 1700s and the late 1700s in some of your major European cities, in the 1800s and the late 1800s in the United States through the 1900s. And back then, a lot of the emphasis was not on making sure species were displayed in naturalistic environments or even focusing on the welfare and the well-being of animals. It was strictly for display, and it was a status symbol for your city to have a major zoo. And the Buttonwood Park Zoo is actually a long history. It is the 12th oldest zoo in the country. Originally started in 1894. We're celebrating 127th year. And typically a city the size of New Bedford is not going to have a zoo or a major zoo. But with the history of wealth, whether it's from whaling or textiles in New Bedford, it was a status symbol to have a zoo. But even back then, as some of the older photos, it really wasn't a space that where the animals were the biggest consideration. Even in the 60s, 70s, I assume these are 60s and 70s based on some of the attire of guests, it was a little bit better, but still, it wasn't focused on modern zoological design. So what do I mean when I say modern zoological design? The Buttonwood Park Zoo is one of only 240 zoos accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And when you consider there's 3,000 zoos or licensed facilities in North America, or actually the United States alone, the Buttonwood Park Zoo is one of the top 7 or 8% of zoos in the entire country. And they look at everything at accreditation from zoo care, animal care, veterinary care, nutrition, finances, business operations, you name it. And for the zoo, like Buttonwood Park Zoo, to be considered in the same ranks or at least accredited like the San Diego Zoo and the National Zoo and the Bronx Zoo, that is quite an achievement. So when you're talking about modern zoo, this is what modern zoological design looks like. This is an excellent example. This is the Dallas Zoo's Giants of the Savannas exhibit. This is an absolute amazing space where you have elephants and antelope and giraffe and zebra in this lush environment where they can graze, where they can browse, where they can swim. And this is a much better representation of the naturalistic approach to exhibit design. Now, if you've been lucky enough to go into Africa and go on safari, this is very similar to what you would see. Now, I will disclose that this exhibit is probably bigger than the entire Buttonwood Park Zoo combined. And this is, I don't even want to know how many tens of millions of dollars this exhibit was, but this is a massive, massive exhibit. At the Buttonwood Park Zoo, we are part of our master plan looking to create naturalistic habitats for our animals as well. And in 2017, we opened the Rainforest Rivers and Reefs exhibits, where we wanted to showcase smaller species found in the Amazon basin. In this particular exhibit that has an enormous amount of perching, over 22 feet of height, natural skylights, aquatic features, we wanted to choose smaller species that would thrive in this habitat. And we wanted to represent them the way they would be found in nature. So it's not just a singular species in a singular exhibit. In that exhibit alone, we have all these different species, golden-headed lion tamarins and owl monkeys, and everyone's favorite, the sloth, and different parrots and different tropical bird species, ducks, turtles, fish. So you have a layering like you would find in the wild, where you have the aquatic species and you have those species living on the shore, and you have birds flying through the trees, and you have primates up in the canopy. And we didn't want to just create a singular habitat. We wanted to make it a rotational habitat. So we have all these different habitats spread throughout the rainforest exhibit, both indoor and outdoor, that we rotate our animals on a regular basis so they have more stimulation, so that they have the opportunity to live in different environments on a daily and weekly basis. And we did that in a very creative way. We're a small zoo. We're only about 7 acres. So we developed these transfer chutes that we can transfer our animals all around the different habitats. We have chutes going through over the ductwork, on the outside of buildings, inside of buildings. But what it allows us to do is really create diverse habitats for our animals in a very limited space, which is our zoo footprint. Another quick example is our poodoo exhibit, which we opened last summer. You can see it's a very lush habitat, but we wanted to focus on smaller species. This is a Chilean poodoo, which is the smallest deer species in the world. It's only about 15 to 20 pounds, and it's paired with crested screamers, one of the most unique waterfowl species. So I wanted to show you some of the modern zoo approaches from a guest perspective, what a guest should be expecting to see when they go to our accredited zoo and where a modern zoo is going. I also wanted to focus on the programs of a modern accredited zoo. It's not just about display. It's not just about recreation. It's about environmental education. These are the mission points of the Buttonwood Park Zoo, the programmatic mission points. It's environmental education. It's wildlife conservation. It's animal care and welfare. Our environmental education programs, being a small zoo, we try to be as interactive as we possibly can, get animals up close and personal with the guest, especially when you're in an urban environment like New Bedford. A lot of the children, they don't explore nature. They're not exploring wildlife. So the zoo is the best chance to gain a better appreciation of wildlife. We do that through our education programs. Our animal care and wellness programs, a lot of people are surprised to find out that we have our own veterinary hospital on site, a fully state-of-the-art veterinary hospital, our own veterinary team. In these particular photos on the left, you have Toby, our black bear, who is getting a tooth extraction. He's an old geriatric bear who had a bad tooth. So we're sedating him and removing a tooth and bringing in a dental specialist. On the other side, we are training our red pandas for various husbandry and veterinary procedures so that we can provide the best possible care for our animals. And also from a wildlife conservation perspective, the Buttonwood Park Zoo, which I said is one of the smaller zoos in the country, we are involved in conservation programs throughout the world. Native species, native insect species, marine species, species through the Caribbean, through Central America, South America, all the way into Asia. We're supporting species for threatened and endangered species. And that's not unique to us. That is what a modern zoo does. So I gave you that quick overview because oftentimes when I'm talking about zoos, there is a misnomer. And part of it is that zoos get all lumped together and there is not a differentiation between good zoos and bad zoos. So I wanted to give you that overview. But what I really wanted to focus on tonight is talking about how we manage animals in zoos and the genetic science and the reproductive science of zoos. As I said, I've been doing this for 30 years, and even to this day, I often get asked the question, where do our animals come from? And there is a belief that a lot of our animals at the zoo are coming from the wild. And I can tell you that might have been the case decades and decades or even centuries ago. That's not the case today. There are very few examples where animals would be coming from the wild. One of the examples is injured or orphaned wildlife that were injured in the wild and for various reasons can't be reintroduced. We have some of those here at the zoo, bears, eagles, cougars, and luckily we were able to give them a forever home here at the zoo. The other situation is critically endangered species, species that on the threat of extinction that are brought into a captive situation because this is the only chance for their survival. They need to be brought into captivity to safeguard them and to put them into breeding programs, or they're going to go extinct, not only in the zoos, but also in the wild as well. And the third one is a relatively new one. It has to do with the black market trade of animals. I'm very much a primate person. I do a lot of work with different primate species. And in the last year alone, I've dealt with 3 monkeys that were illegally smuggled over the border, one in Texas, one in California, and one that showed up a couple weeks ago in Nebraska, that were basically, and not to get too gruesome here, that their mother was shot from a tree in the wild, the baby was pried from them, and it was imported illegally into the United States for the pet trade. And we see them coming into our ports, into our airports all the time. And that's a very gruesome side of the black market trade, but that is really the only time an animal is going to be taken from the wild. So where do animals come from? Well, they come from captive breeding programs. They come from captive breeding programs, and in the case of accredited zoos, spread throughout all of North America, both the United States and Canada. And when we're talking about captive breeding programs, we're really focused on genetic diversity. We want to maximize our genetic diversity with our populations. And the first thing to do, what is genetic diversity? And you can go on the internet and get various definitions of genetic diversity. And of course, the internet is always right. So what is genetic diversity? Well, genetic diversity is the genetic variability present in a species. It's the various genes that are present in a species or a population of animals. That's what genetic diversity is. And why is genetic diversity important? The large variation of different gene sets allows an individual or a whole population to have capacity to endure environmental stress in any form. And the best way to explain that is the more related a population, the less genetically diverse a population, the more at risk it is from an evolutionary standpoint or survivability standpoint of surviving environmental stresses. And those environmental stresses could be climate change, they could be deforestation, there could be introduction of invasive species, there could be disease outbreaks. In general, as a principle, the more related your population is, the more at risk it is of an environmental stress or a catastrophic event going extinct. So what does genetic diversity mean for zoos? Well, in a zoo, the standard genetic goal of managing animals is to maintain populations of 90% gene diversity over 100 years. And when gene diversity falls below 90% and your inbreeding increases, you see stuff like lower fertility, lower birth rates, small litter size, greater neonatal or baby mortality. Basically, you have a less healthy population. You have a less robust population, because you have a more related population that is being impacted by inbreeding. By the way, that 90% gene diversity over 100 years, that's 90% compared to what you would normally find in the wild. So it's 90% of the genes in the wild for 100 years or 10 generations of an animal's life. That's how we measure genetic diversity in a zoo. But the question still comes, or still arises, why is genetic diversity so important in a zoological setting? And there are two main reasons for that. First off, more and more zoos are involved in reintroduction programs. As more species become threatened, as more species become endangered in the wild, zoos become safeguards for species. And in many times, zoo animals are bred for reintroduction into the wild. Now, this is not an easy thing, and it can only be done if the habitat in the wild where these animals became threatened, endangered, or extinct is basically protected. But increasingly, zoos are more involved in reintroduction programs. Photos up here include scimitar horned oryx in North Africa, golden lion tamarins in Brazil, California condors in the West, black-footed ferrets in the Central Plains. The little mouse there, that's a Perdido Key beach mouse. I was actually involved in that reintroduction program in Florida and Alabama. And you want to talk about ticking off landowners, try reintroduce an endangered mouse species to prime real estate, beach real estate in Florida, Alabama. But it was a great success story, and I'm very proud of it. I'm not sure all the owners agree with us, but it was originally there, and we put it back into place. You got Wyoming toads. You have red wolves that are introduced in eastern parts of the United States. And when you're doing reintroduction programs, you need to make sure that the animals that you're reintroducing are as genetically diverse as possible, so they are as healthy and robust and can withstand environmental pressures as much as possible. And the other reason is because we're dealing with insurance populations. Many of the zoo species that are threatened or endangered or critically endangered in the wild that are managed in zoos, they are safeguarded. They're biological reservoirs in case the population goes extinct in the wild. The only chance of survival is to be able to reintroduce them back to the wild. And again, if you're relying on this biological safeguard in your zoological, accredited zoological parks around the country and around the world, you need to make sure these animals are healthy and genetically diverse. So how do we measure genetics? Excuse me, how do we measure genetics in a population? There's a lot of different ways you can do it. Actually, there's two main ways you can do it. When I say this, a lot of people think, well, it's ancestry.com, but that doesn't really work for thousands and thousands of species that are managed in zoos. It's very lucrative to have the gene sequence for humans so that you can basically track your lineage or your ancestry. That doesn't necessarily work for an insect species or a small duck species or a small primate species. At the Buttonwood Park Zoo, we have been involved in these types of genetic studies to look at relatedness in a population. We were involved in one study for a Bear's poachard species, which is an endangered Asian duck species. And I can tell you, to run that study, it took about $30,000, and many zoos contributed. So it's a very expensive propagation. Very expensive to do in zoos. So how do we track genetics in zoos? Most of the times it's through what are called regional and international stud books. These are historical documents that look at the species that the first time they came into captivity, going back hundreds of years, and we're documenting their pedigree, we're documenting their history, we're documenting who bred and how many offspring and how many offspring survived, and if that offspring spread, and if that offspring's offspring spread. And this is a historic stud book, similar to what you'd see in AKC maybe with some dog breeds, but this is much more elaborate and is really looking at the demographics of hundreds and hundreds of different species in North American zoos. So then what do you do with the stud book data? So either through a lab or through pedigree recording, what do you do with this genetics? And that's where it comes to species survival plans of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Species survival plans are cooperatively managed programs for threatened and endangered species that look at the genetic diversity to help create sustainable populations that are healthy and robust. And there are hundreds of species survival plans. There are over 500 species survival plans in zoos across America that look at the genetic diversity and look at the demographics of population as a means to make sure these animals are thriving in zoos, again, for reintroduction and possibly for biological reservoir reasons. So once you have that information, you have the pedigree information, and you have developed a species survival plan, you need to use this information to help manage species. Now, I am a SSP or species survival plan coordinator for several species. As I said before, I'm very into primates, and this is a species survival plan I created for spider monkeys. There are multiple spider monkey subspecies in zoos that I oversee the management across the entire country. And this is a breeding and transfer plan. It's a data analyst, a population analysis, and breeding and transfer plan. So we take all that data from the stud book, take that all that data from the labs, and we put it into all kinds of genetic formulas, and we create the most genetically diverse population we can. I won't go through this now. This is just one page of this document where we're looking at found genome equivalents and gene diversity and mean kinships and genetic diversity laws and inbreeding coefficients. So there's a lot of science that goes into it. But the goal is to create parents, basically putting male and female of a species together so that we can maximize genetic diversity. This strange little chart here is an end result of what happens. This is for a spider monkey species. On the left, you have the males. On the top, you have the females. And if you cross the lines, you go down the top and you go down the side and you go across the cup, you will come to an intersection and you'll say, this animal from Pueblo Zoo how does it match with a animal from the Nashville Zoo? And you go across and you get a number, a numeric value. And on this document is called MateRx. A 1, a 2, a 3, that's a good genetic parent. If it is a 4, it doesn't hurt the population, but it's not doing much to help the population. If it's a 5 or 6, you're increasing inbreeding in your population. That is a very watered down version of all the genetics that goes involved. But basically a breeding and transfer plan, it takes genetic data that has been recorded and it uses that genetic data to make the best parents of animals based again on genetic diversity principles. As a means to maximize genetic diversity, we make these transfers. So the end result may be, hey, the spider monkey at the San Diego Zoo, that animal should go to the Bronx Zoo and be paired with another spider monkey at the Bronx Zoo, and that will help increase your genetic diversity and in theory, increase your genetic health in a population. Now, this is another recommendation. This is at Buttonwood Park Zoo. I'm going to skip through that to go on to the next slide. At the Buttonwood Park Zoo, we have 30 SSPs that we are currently managing for all these different species, and that number is growing. We're involved in over 30 genetic management plans for all of these different species. And this is truly how we manage animals in zoos. Just about every breeding species we have in the zoo is managed under an SSP program where we're looking at genetics. Which leads us to reproductive science. Because, and by the way, this is a photo I love. This is an emperor tamarin. These are twin emperor tamarins that were born at the Buttonwood Park Zoo. This female actually, some of the times these programs are not just on a national level, they're on an international level. This female actually came in from England. We realized that the population of emperor tamarins in England was not related to the population in the United States. So we brought it from a zoo in England and she was paired with a male hare. And we're happy to say that she gave birth at the zoo, and we have these wonderful babies at the zoo. Now, some of the challenges of this genetic parent, this parent of animals, is that as humans, as we're putting these animals together, one thing we have difficult time determining is zoo mate choice or animal mate choice. So in the wild, you have thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of penguins living together. And these penguins are choosing their own mate. And there's sexual selection that goes on. And truthfully, we only know a fraction of why an animal chooses another animal to mate with. But a lot of it has to do with evolution and how they are basically keeping their populations genetically diverse. Well, we can't create thousands and tens of thousands of penguins in an exhibit at a zoo. I have a polar bears up there where males will travel hundreds of miles to find a mate. In zoos, we look at the genetic diversity and say, hey, this animal here and this animal here would make a great genetic parent. Let's send them to this zoo, has a lot of experience working with this animal, and we hope it's going to work. And sometimes it works, as the Emperor Tamarin showed with those beautiful twins that were born. But sometimes there's a lot of challenges that goes on with this, and sometimes there is a lack of compatibility, and there's a lack of breeding success. And that has to do with the fact of a variety of different features, but some of it is a lack of compatibility. Some of it is reproductive issues. At the Buttonwood Park Zoo, we do a lot of training of our animals. It's all positive reinforcement. Here's that same Emperor Tamarin mom who our keeper has trained to take a sweet nectar from a syringe because it takes longer to get it out of the syringe. And she'll stand there and be tolerant of the veterinarian down below running an ultrasound. All the reproductive science, all the tools and equipment that you use in human medicine, we're using on our animals as well. So we were actually able to track the birth of this animal through ultrasound and the development, the pregnancy of this animal up to birth through ultrasound, which gives us a lot of information that we need to be successful in managing our populations. There are other tools we use to figure out why animals are not breeding or when we should put animals together. When you work in a zoo, you deal with a lot of animal poop. Animal poop is something we deal with by the ton load throughout the year. But that fecal matter that we get at zoos is actually very important. We can do fecal hormone analysis. In this particular chart here, we're measuring progesterone levels in female animals to track whether they coming into normal estrus cycle. So we can submit feces to a lab, and by extracting the hormones from the feces, we can see if an animal is coming into estrus, has a normal reproductive cycle, which is very important because it can give us clues whether it's the male that is an issue, that it's a female that's an issue for not breeding. And for species that don't live together their entire lives, we know when we can introduce animals, when the key time to put animals in when they are ovulating. Other science we use is assisted reproduction, because sometimes no matter how much we want a pairing of animals to work, sometimes they don't work. And when you're dealing with species that are on the verge of extinction, sometimes we have assisted reproduction, whether it's in vitro fertilization or assisted or artificial insemination. And it's on small species like frogs up above, pandas, rhinos down below. Again, most of the medicine that you're using in human medicine fields or reproductive fields, you're using in zoological fields as well, veterinary fields as well. One of the advances that we have seen in zoos is cryopreservation, the frozen zoo. Now, there's just a handful of zoos that are dealing with cryopreservation, that are dealing with frozen zoos. Because they're incredibly expensive and the resources are enormous in order to be able to do this. But there are, again, threatened and endangered species. There are extinct species that no longer exist in zoos or in the wild, that have their sperm, their eggs, their DNA has been stored to be able to hopefully bring them back to the wild. Or example I use all the time, there was a species of rhino, the northern white rhino, that is extinct in the wild, and there are just a handful of them left in zoos. The San Diego Zoo was able to extract eggs and sperm from those animals. They were able to fertilize an egg in a lab setting, and they actually take that fertilized egg and put it into a surrogate rhino, a southern white rhino, which is threatened and endangered, but still on this planet. They're able to take those fertilized eggs, put them into a surrogate white rhino, and that white rhino is hopefully will give birth to northern white rhinos. And these are some of the science we use to try to save species, these endangered species that, again, are on the verge of extinction, if not already extinct and only remain in a frozen state. So with all of this, we do have significant success with the breeding of animals, and we do have significant success with the genetic diversity of our animals. And sometimes we're so successful that we have to look at zoo birth control. We do it a little bit different here in the United States. Some of the countries in Europe, and there's been a lot of press on this, they let their animals breed and then they cull or they euthanize their animals once they get to a certain age. Here in the United States and most of North America, we do prefer to use birth control. And there's a variety of birth control methods we use. We use different types of birth control implants so that we do not overbreed our animals. And the best example I can give you of that is you can have a pair of animals that are not very well represented genetically in a population. So you want those animals to breed. So they breed and they have a litter of cubs. And then they have another litter of cubs. And then their cubs have cubs and their cubs. So basically what was originally a genetics that were not very well represented, in very quick order in small populations, they become overrepresented. And so you don't want to have too many related animals in one population. We use birth control at the zoo, and there's a lot of science that goes into it that we focus on. So to wrap up my rapid presentation, I know I went through a lot of detail. I know I talk fast as well, so I apologize about that. I want to give you a little bit story of how this all is applied at a zoo. This species right here, this is a Geldes monkey. This is a small primate species. It's only about, I don't know, 6-8 inches long. If you don't include their tail, they only weigh about 1.5 pounds. And it's one of the species that we were looking to bring in for our new rainforest rivers and reefs building here at the zoo. And this is a South American species. They're found through the Western Amazon and Peru and Bolivia and Brazil. And we identified through an SSP coordinator. There was a stud book for the species. There was an SSP for the coordinator. There was a group, a family group of Geldes monkeys that were being, were at an accredited zoo in the Midwest of the United States. But unfortunately, that zoo had run out of space for the very successful breeding group, and they could not breed these animals anymore because they honestly did not have any space in the zoo. Well, we wanted to bring that species over to our zoo, but there was a catch. These guys were on birth control. The mother in the group, the only breeding female in the group, was on birth control. And typically when you use birth control, and these are called Geldes monkeys, but they're a type of tamarin. And typically when you use birth control in tamarin, it's very reversible. You go in, you remove the implant, and the animal comes back to normal estrous cycle, normal reproductive cycles. But for whatever reason, with Geldes monkeys, they are known that if you use different types of contraception on them, implants on them, birth control implants on them, it can cause permanent sterility. There's one type of implant that was used in the 70s and 80s that sterilized many females in the population. There's another type of implant we use now called desloralinus perlerin that is very effective and is reversible, but it's only reversible for 6 months. If you leave the implant in for more than 6 months, it will cause permanent sterility. At least that's what we thought. So we brought these animals to the zoo, and Ava had already had her implant in place for over 6 months. It was going on 7-8 months. And by the time they came out of quarantine at the zoo, all animals go through quarantine before they go into the zoo here at Buttonwood, we removed her implant. But by that time, it had already been 8 or 9 months that she had an implant on, and we were afraid that she was going to be permanently sterilized. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to determine, is this animal sterilizing? Is this animal still going through normal estrous cycle? Once the implant's removed, will she cycle normally? And how do we do that? Well, we go back to one. We go back to poop. We go back to something we deal with every day, it's poop. We want to send her poop in for fecal analysis to see if she's under a normal estrous cycle. And when you have a group of monkeys in this mixed habitat with all these different animals, how do you find their poop? So our keepers became very creative, and they used food quality glitter. So they basically were given just Ava a piece of fruit, a piece of food that was covered in this glitter. And the next morning we would go into the habitat and we would find the golden poop. We would find the golden poop from our female Ava, and then we could submit that golden poop to a lab to find out if Ava is cycling on a regular basis. And they have to be collected every day, and you have to do a profile over many weeks and many months. And we're happy to say that we did find out that Ava was cycling, and we're happy to say that a few months later, Ava did give birth at the zoo. This is one of the babies she's had at the zoo. Its eyes have not changed color yet. So in summary, basically what you have is you have for decades somebody who's been recording the pedigree of this vulnerable species. There is an SSP coordinator who has been making pairings and staying on top of the population and making sure that population is genetically diverse and there is no inbreeding in the population. You have reproductive science, fecal hormone analysis that we are collecting samples and sending them to labs to look at estrus cycles. We are able to monitor the pregnancy of this animal through ultrasound and other different types of reproductive science, basically monitor, make sure the pregnancy is doing well. And then we have the animal care programs once it's born to make sure these animals are thriving at the zoo. Now that is a very simple snapshot, but that's just a quick summary of what it takes to manage animals in the zoo, and what it takes to manage animals in the zoo if you care about their future and you care about their ability to be biological safeguards or be part of reintroduction programs. So I do apologize for the rapid fire of data. It was kind of difficult to bring it down to a 30-minute level. So hopefully I did it justice by explaining some of the programs we have at zoos. And I think at this point, we will be taking some questions.
We will. Keith, thank you very much. This is Bob Roche here from the Bedford Whaling Museum, and honored to be part of the small team that pulls together the New Bedford Science Cafe presentations. And being moderator, I'm going to take privilege and make the first comment and question. So also being behind the scenes and able to see who's on the call or who's on this conversation, I recognize enough names that have been working around here long enough to know that there are several of us tonight who remember back when Buttonwood Park Zoo was basically an embarrassment to the region, and now it is an asset. And one of the things that anybody who has ever heard me talk about the zoo has mentioned, and it ties into a question or a comment from John Bullard, is one of the best things I thought the zoo has ever done is taken Buttonwood Brook, which when it went through the zoo originally was channelized with concrete walls, removed all the concrete and made it a natural embankment again, which has improved the health of Aponegantsit Bay at the receiving end. I'm wondering, other than genetics and these, the benefits of natural filtration, if you've heard any other stories from people in your 8 years at the zoo that have said the zoo has also done this or that for the natural environment.
That's a very good question. And that's part of the philosophy. As I said, I went rapid fire through a lot of different information, but at the zoo, first and foremost, we are focused on education. And it's, you're not going to be educated if you're basically just saying, this is what you should do. We don't do it here at the zoo, but this is what you should do. So we are really focusing on a lot of our practices, our sustainability practices at the zoo, our environmental practices. We have done a lot of gardening recently for different types of butterfly species, including monarch butterfly species. We teach classes on that. We're involved in Frog Watch, where we're teaching citizen science, citizens in the community, citizen scientists on how to identify frog calls, and we have seen increases of frogs on zoo ground species we did not realize were on zoo grounds, and truthfully that's probably attributed, or it is attributed, to the cleanliness of the brook. There's a lot of different things we do on zoo grounds, our horticulture programs. There's a lot that goes into it. So yes, we're very proud of that brook. I cannot take credit for that, but I would agree with you that is one of the wisest decisions that was ever made for the Buttonwood Park Zoo.
Totally agree. And I'm going to follow up with the question from John Bullard, former mayor, and John's been involved in the city on several levels for decades. Could you comment about the plans by the try this again in English. In particular, could you comment about the plans by the Buzzards Bay Coalition to study how Buttonwood Brook, which runs through the zoo, might be restored? Seems like it's partially restored, but is there more restoration
Yeah,
necessary?
there is. And I honestly, I am not an expert on that, but I can tell you, Carrie, who you were talking to earlier, Carrie, our curator of education, who also runs our sustainability programs, the Buttonwood Park Zoo is actually going to be in charge, oh, not in charge, in part, a part of a brook monitoring program. That we're actually going to be looking at the health of the brook. So basically, we're going to be looking at is what does the system, what is the health of the water that's coming into the zoo? What is the health of the water when it leaves the zoo? Hopefully, it'll be healthier when it leaves the zoo than when it comes into the zoo. There's a lot of challenges. We've dealt with botulism outbreaks in some of the animals, particularly wild birds at the zoo, because I think a lot of people see that Buttonwood Pond, it's not as deep as it should be. There's a lot of vegetation growth. There's an enormous pressure by way more Canada geese than truly should be there. Historically, Canada geese was a migratory species, and they're living there year round because of availability of food. So there's a lot of pressures. So we are going to be part of that study. It's going to be run by Buzzards Bay Coalition, and we're very excited to be part of that. And, if we find out during that study, if there's things that we can be doing to improve the brook at the zoo, we're all for that as well.
You just triggered another opportunity for commentary. Do you want to say anything to folks that are listening? I think this is the converted that are tuning in, but any comments on the feeding of white bread and those kinds of things to the birds that go to the pond and the problems that causes?
Yeah, and I think I've done a public service announcement on cable access on this as well. So the problem is, and that's part of the reasons why these Canada geese are staying here year round, and it's the same for mallard and some other species as well, is that you're feeding something that's high in calories, but has limited nutritional value. We're always hearing you shouldn't be eating white bread, you should be eating whole wheat bread. And I'm not to say that you should be giving whole wheat bread to these animals either, or multi-grain bread. But basically what you're doing is you're loading them with calories without a lot of nutrition. And the other thing is you're asking them not to act natural, because they're not out foraging for food. They're not out there grazing. And when they're grazing, they're not getting the grass and all the minuscule insects that are on the grass. And the biggest problem is goslings. So everybody sees this time of year. I'm up and down Buttonwood Park all the time, and there's hundreds of goslings out there, way too many, but that's a different story for a different day. And people feed them bread. Well, the problem is these goslings are gobbling up this bread, which has no nutritional value. And because they're getting so many calories, they're growing too quickly. The birds are growing too quickly. Their wings, their feathers, everything is growing too quickly, and they ended up with wing deformities. And when you have a wing deformities, basically in the future, these birds will not be able to fly. So the person who's feeding bread to these birds actually causing long-term harm, particularly to goslings, because there's a distinct possibility they're going to become too obese or have deformities that will prevent them from flying in the future, which makes them very vulnerable for prey and can guarantee you they're not going to migrate south for the winter.
Good. Thanks, Keith. Okay, so next question actually comes from the gentleman who got us started with our introductions, Nathan Duclos Ricard. Where are we here? What has been the most challenging SSP you have been a part of, and why?
I've been a part of hundreds of SSPs in my career. One of the most challenging ones I've been part of is the one I actually still manage. It's for bush dogs. And bush dogs is a very unique canid species or canine species that's found in the forest of South America and a little bit in Central America as well. But the biggest challenge with these guys is that they're very difficult to introduce. They live in extended family groups where they only have one breeding animal, one breeding female in the entire group. The female puts out a hormone that sexually suppresses all the other females in the group. They're difficult to breed. Their genetics are scarce. There's not a lot of known about their reproduction in the wild. It has just been an incredibly challenging species. Trying to manage them on available foods we have here. It's not easy for us to feed armadillo that they would normally be eating in the wild. So from a genetic standpoint, which the genetics are not strong, from a reproductive struggle standpoint, because they have a very complex reproductive system, it's been a very challenging species.
Okay. Next question comes from Eugene Gallagher. And Eugene and everybody else, thank you for tuning in tonight and for your questions. He asks, how often do you circumvent animal mate choice by using artificial insemination? And are there advantages for natural matings?
That's an excellent question. You're not circumventing a lot. There is some, the more critically endangered species, the more likely you are to circumvent a breeding for assisted reproduction. And when you're dealing with a very small population, say 20 animals, and this animal's on the verge of going extinct, and every animal is incredibly important. Sumatran rhinos come to mind, which there are very few. That's when you're more likely to get involved in assisted reproduction. There are other situations when an animal is a very large animal, a tiger or a rhino, and it's honestly a much more practical option to use assisted reproduction than trying to send a rhino across the country. It is much more affordable and practical to send sperm and eggs across the country and do procedures. So sometimes that is done. The general rule is that you want to have natural breeding. It's part of a normal animal's life cycle, and you try to emulate that as much as possible. But there are rare cases that you are involved in that as well.
Okay, thank you. Next comes from Ann Parson, who behind the scenes whips us all into shape when it comes to New Bedford Science Cafe. She says, thank you. The reintroduced mouse in Florida, how well has it done and how can you tell?
It's a very good question. And I'm 8.5 years removed from that program. It was not realistic for me to continue to be involved when I moved up to New Bedford, but originally it did extremely well. I haven't heard the most recent population updates, but I heard that it was thriving well. The reintroductions were put on hold because the animals that were reintroduced, and there were still some animals left in the wild. So the combination of captive bred animals reintroduced to wild animals, these animals were thriving. And the key to that is making sure you're protecting the habitat. You have the animals there. If the animals are genetically diverse, they'll find a way to reproduce. The way they monitor the population is they did trapping. They had these very ingenious PVC traps that they would catch animals. They were actually able to do DNA samples. They had little ear tags on them that we could check them, and collars on them. So we were actually able to monitor the population. Once a year, we went out and we trapped animals and we took samples from them, and then we put the animals right back into the wild. But that's how we've been monitoring the population, and it was a success story.
Oh, good.
With that being said, it's incredibly vulnerable because it's right in a very prone hurricane area. And that's one of the impacts that originally wiped out part of the population, was a nasty Category 4 hurricane coming overhead.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Eugene Gallagher, completely different from his first. Cheetahs have lost almost all genetic diversity.
Mm-hmm.
How many zoo populations have little genetic diversity to conserve?
Could you say that again? So you have bottlenecks in cheetahs. It's a textbook bottleneck that's taught in schools. Is he asking about the gene diversity of cheetahs in captivity or other populations?
It seems like it's cheetahs.
Okay. Yeah, the genetics of cheetahs is not great. There have been some animals that have, because they're often managed on an international level, there are some animals that have been transferred from sanctuaries or zoos in Africa and other parts of the world. But sometimes it is what it is. With cheetahs, you will see all those inbreeding factors, which is low survivability, low fertility. But there's nothing else you can do. You might have some frozen cheetah samples, but truthfully, the bottleneck of cheetahs happened a long time ago. So although it is not the most robust genetic population, what you don't want to do is those populations become even more depleted from genetic diversity standpoint, become even more inbred. And that is why it's incredibly important to really monitor what animals are breeding, both in the zoo and really monitor the populations in the wild as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Kelly Pelletier. How often are you sending or receiving animals for reproduction purposes?
And that's an excellent question. And again, from a content standpoint, I only could bring a portion of the picture. There's a lot more factors. It isn't just mad scientists. We don't play God all day long and say, oh, genetic diversity is the only consideration. There are a lot of considerations that we take into factor. We take in the health of the animal, the reproductive health of the animal. Has this animal bred before? We look at the age of the animal. If an animal hasn't bred by a certain age, its likelihood of being a successful breeder is limited. Is the animal post-reproductive or an age that's approaching post-reproduction? Is this animal a high-stress species? Is it a long transfer? Is it a difficult transfer? So all those factors that go in. We try to minimize the transfer as much as possible, but in order to maintain those genetic diverse populations, transfers do happen. And I wouldn't say, I mean, we don't take an animal in for a year, then send it out a year later. We usually will have animals for several years. Lots of animals we have for their lifetime. Sometimes we do need to switch animals up, but we take animal welfare into consideration when we do that.
Okay. And you have a big thank you here from Shannon Sign In saying fantastic talk, much appreciated. Question from Patty Jason. Keith, wonderful talk, thank you. With the tamarin pairing from England, will one of those offspring ultimately go back to the British Zoo, or will each offspring go to be paired elsewhere?
They will not go back to the British Zoo. That's a very astute question. The reason they won't go back to England, so when we approach, and in my job, I spend a lot of time working with European colleagues, particularly on primate species and some waterfowl species as well. So what you have, and this is very valuable for a population, you have a bunch of tamarins, or you have some tamarins in England in this particular case, that they come from lineage that have been very successful. We call it being overrepresented. What it means is they were the best breeders. They were the most successful breeders. But because their lineage was so successful, they're overrepresented in England. They're not represented in the United States. So you bring them over to the United States because this is basically considered founder populations. These are new genetics being brought into your population. You would not breed those animals and send them back to England because they're already overrepresented in England. If you were going to send any animals from the United States to England, you would find overrepresented animals in the United States that would be founders or genetically valuable in England. And I deal with this on a regular basis. You know, one of the challenges is there are only so many good zoos in the United States and Europe, and your populations can be only so big because you only have so much space. So sometimes we are doing transfers over the oceans. I mean, I've coordinated spider monkeys that have gone from Canada and the United States to Australia. And this is part of these breeding programs as we're trying to make sure that we have genetic diverse populations, not only in the United States, but in other regions of the world.
Great. Thank you for that. And Patty, thank you for your question. Patty, I should say thank you for your support of so many local organizations too.
Including
Next question comes from Next question comes from Stephen Witzig from UMass Dartmouth. Great presentation. Thank you. What's the next phase of the zoo master plan that will be opened? And what's the dream for the zoo? In parentheses, if you could think big without bounds, close parentheses.
Thank you, Steve. The next plan is our educational facilities. We have been delayed. I think a lot of people are dealing with construction cost issues right now as the cost of materials is skyrocketed, and the cost of labor is actually very high right now as well. But we will be looking to build an animal ambassador building and a new education center at the zoo. We have most of that fundraising in place, so those will be the next focuses. To answer the question on a big picture standpoint, I think in many regards, the fact that the zoo is 127 years old, I think a lot of people have taken it for granted because it's always been here. And Bob, as you said before, it has a checkered history. I mean, it was bad for a long period of time. And I think a lot of people, particularly during the pandemic, were thrilled to come back to the zoo and actually see, wow, this is a quality institution. This is actually quite beautiful. I haven't been here. My kids are grown. My grandchildren aren't going to the zoo with me anymore, whatever it may be. And we actually saw some robust attendance over the last year of the pandemic because we had the outdoor campus. As a big picture, what I would really want to do is for the Buttonwood Park Zoo to continue to be programmatically strong. We are never going to be one of the largest zoos. We're not going to be the most impactful with the number of animals we have, but it doesn't mean we can't have huge programmatic success. And when I talk about programmatic success, first and foremost is environmental education programs. We deal with this in all of our education-based not-for-profit organizations in New Bedford or the community, South Coast community. How many urban children living in the urban environments, they just don't have access to so many education programs, in our cases, into nature and to wildlife, to really have those strong education programs to continue to support wildlife conservation. I have no desire to just have species at the zoo for the sake of species. I want to make sure that we're making significant contribution to wildlife conservation, and I want to make sure we're providing the best care we have from the animals. Those are our mission points. So to a big picture standpoint, I want to make sure that we are providing the best care possible for the animals, and we are an incredibly strong programmatic zoo that focuses on our mission. Don't worry about being the biggest zoo. Don't worry about having the largest attendance. Just be the best within our 7-acre footprint and really make a difference, not only in the zoo world, not only wildlife, but particularly in the community.
Great, thank you. And for those of you that have not met Carrie already, Carrie Hawthorne, she's great. She does a fantastic job. She's a great peer and colleague, but I'm sure Keith already knew that.
Yes, she is fantastic.
Question from Benjamin Recchia. Thank you for the solid overview of zoo conservation genetics. Could you comment on how zoo professionals like yourself learn the biology needed to manage modern zoo populations, in parentheses, for example, coursework, on-the-job training, etc.?
So there's been an evolution in zoos. Historically, and I'm not even going back that far, but say 30, 40 years, you saw a lot of people coming from the agricultural industries. A lot of you zookeepers, they grew up on farms. They took care of livestock and they get practical experience working with zoos. And you did have some scientists. Obviously, you had your veterinarians who are involved in veterinary science programs. More and more over the last 2 decades, you're seeing the scientific approach to zoological management. Just about every zookeeper, even from entry level, has some type of biological undergraduate degree. There's a lot of master's degrees. There's a lot of specialization in the zoo field, where you have reproductive science, geneticists, behavioral scientists, welfare scientists. Smaller zoo at Buttonwood, we still have veterinary programs here. We have master students doing research. We're working with local universities. We have a robust internship program. When I was down at the Palm Beach Zoo, we had multiple PhDs working for us on various behavioral and different zoological sciences. So more and more zoos are becoming scientific. There is still a practical need, because all the science in the world will not teach you how to introduce 2 rhinos together or how to transport 2 spider monkeys, or there's a lot of art that goes into zoological management as well, but more and more it's scientific based. I can tell you, when I started in this field, there was a lot more of a cowboy mentality. Oh, we got to get the animal to the vet. I'm going to go in there with a net. I'm going to grab up the animal and have it. And I used to be involved in a lot of animal catch-ups. I'm not involved in animal catch-ups anymore. The keepers, they have figured it out way more than I ever did. They are training the animals, anything you want to do. If we have to do an examination on a bear or a cougar, the bear or the cougar is trained to present its hip, and the veterinarian can walk right up to the cougar and do an injection in its side, and the animal goes to sleep, and we transport it to the hospital. Those days are gone. So there's a lot of science. And those, honestly, even that, what I just said, that positive reinforcement training, it's based on scientific principles. So everything in the zoo is becoming more and more scientific.
All right. I have another question for you.
Sure.
Do you, in this is a general question, do you think zoos and AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquaria, have done an adequate job of explaining the non-display role of zoos?
Absolutely not.
People always expect just to go, to see things, but do you think that the message is out there well enough to explain all the super important behind the scenes things that are happening?
Yeah, and I honestly didn't even touch the surface of it. I mean, there's so much that we do. I think the zoo word is probably forever tainted. I think you're seeing more and more institutions remove the word zoo from their title. We have it here at the Buttonwood Park Zoo. And I did a TEDx talk on this, and I put a lot of focus on that. And it's because to the general person in the community, a zoo is a zoo is a zoo. They don't differentiate between an accredited zoo and a roadside zoo. And what you end up having is when there is press, and whether it's social media, the world we live in now, of something horrific happening at a zoo or something catastrophic happening at a zoo, a general person in the community doesn't go, oh, wait a sec, that wasn't an accredited zoo. They hear zoo, and there's so many bad zoos out there. And Tiger King was a perfect example. It's absolutely horrific. And what ends up happening is you end up having a lot of people who in principle are against zoos. So to answer your question, we have so much science that we do behind the scenes. We have so much dedication to our animals. We have over 1,000 animals when you consider all the fish we have at the zoo. We do a welfare assessment. We assess the welfare of every animal, including every fish and every insect and every frog at the zoo on an annual basis to make sure we are providing the best possible care we have. So no, we have not done a good enough job. And even when we do a good job, when we have the opportunity like Science Cafe to come out here and talk about it, tomorrow there will be something horrific happens that will overshadow it. And that's one of the reasons that many places, many reputable organizations are going away from the woods. They become a conservation park, a wildlife park.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or in the Q&A function. And we've hit 4 minutes past 8. So I'm going to offer you the opportunity to give us some wrap-up thoughts. And then I think Jocelyn will take us maybe, or Nathan will take us through the end of our night tonight.
I just thank you. It is an opportunity. I think, Bob, you said it, we don't do a good enough job. I think I would be surprised that even some people who've heard me talk before, I think people will be surprised how much does go on behind the scenes at zoos. And as much as I can, I get out there and talk about it. But if you haven't been to the zoo, it's really worth coming to. I mean, you can look at you can look at the Whaling Museum. You have so many collections behind the scenes. You do so much behind the scenes of the Whaling Museum. It's the same at the zoo. And we offer tours and we offer education programs and we try to uncover the behind the scenes. So we're very proud of the work and we're very proud of the community support we have received, particularly during the pandemic, but all the time in our 127-year history, even when we were absolutely horrible.
Thank you, Keith. Nathan, do you want to make any closing comments as our host before we turn it over to Jocelyn?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bob. We do have just a couple minutes. If anybody has any last minute questions they want to get in, we can take one or two more. While I'm chatting here, feel free to throw those in the chat. Keith, we want to say thank you so much for giving us a behind the scenes kind of access to the zoo here, right in our own backyard. I cannot wait to tell my students about glitter poop.
There you go.
That's the funniest thing in the world. I'm gonna love that.
You can use blueberries sometimes, and everything that doesn't pass in the human digestive system, sometimes you can do that as well. But we found glitter really sparkles in the morning when we're going to collect it.
And it's just more fun. You're not going to miss it. It never
Makes
goes
for
away.
a great story, doesn't it?
We also want to say a huge thank you to Jocelyn and the New Bedford Whaling Museum for helping us through this year of virtual science cafes. We couldn't have done it without you. Super, super appreciative of your help. As a reminder, this is our last science cafe for this spring. We are going to be taking a break for July and August and coming back, fingers crossed, again in person at Greasy Luck, like the good old days. With that, I'm going to take a look. I do not see any other messages in our
I haven't
chat.
seen it either.
All right. Well, we wish everyone a safe and great summer. Feel free to stay in touch. You can check us out on our Facebook page, or sorry, on the Weebly page, I mean. We have that there. So enjoy your summer, everyone. Stay safe out there. We'll see you this fall.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.